Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about a camera that I made just for the purpose of explaining. Now this is my camera. It's kind of a weird camera, but I think it's going to help make you understand the concepts. So this is my camera body. This is the lens right here. And my shutter is in the front right here. So this is my shutter. Okay? And the aperture is inside here. And if you can see, I also have a sensor. Okay? So here is the lens. This is the aperture. This is the shutter. And this is the camera. The shutter is going to let light come in. And how fast you close it is going to determine how much light is going to go through over here and reach the sensor to register a picture. But if the aperture is really small, or there's a really small hole over here that lets the light come in, it's going to get further reduced. Okay? So you can control light coming into the camera using your shutter, your aperture, and the third thing is the ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. Okay? So you might ask, why are we looking at the shutter speed, the aperture, and ISO? If all three can do the same thing, why do we talk about it at all? Why can't we just use shutter speed for everything? All the three items have their own advantages and disadvantages, and you have the creative freedom to use them to make a picture or an exposure that suits your needs. Now let's talk about the shutter. In our make-believe camera, this is the shutter right here. There's an airplane flying out there. So let's talk about the shutter. This is our make-believe camera, and this is our shutter right here. Okay? So this is our shutter. Now, if you think about it, light coming in has to come in through this door or the shutter, and then it has to come and go back to the sensor. It has to be focused over there. If you think about a magnifier, the one that you used to use or you use to get the sun's rays, and you light up something, you have this light coming in, it magnifies, and it gets all the light to a point. The meaning of that is that light is in focus, and that distance from the magnifier up to the paper, that is called the focal length. Okay? The lens of a camera does pretty much the same thing. It focuses the light coming in onto the sensor inside over here. It focuses the light, and that distance is called the focal length, and we'll get into that a little later. But all I'm trying to say is that when light comes into the shutter, it is focused on the sensor. If the shutter is too fast, it's going to let just a little amount of light go in, and if the shutter is really slow, it's going to let a lot of light get in. So we tend to use shutter speeds for different times of the day, for example, or if you're using a flash. So let's say this is your camera. This is the shutter speed. Okay, the less of the light you want coming inside the camera, the higher the shutter speed needs to be set. Okay, suppose you're taking a picture in the night. You want to take a picture of maybe the moon or buildings or the cityscape at night. What we would do is we would leave the shutter open for a long time. Shutters close at fraction of seconds. So if you use 1 second or 2 seconds, it's a pretty long exposure. So I would say in the night you would use 1 or 2 seconds. But what if you have very little light and you really do not want to, and you're not getting anything in 2 seconds? What do? What you do is you leave the shutter open for as long as you want. A lot of cameras that have manual settings have something called a bulb mode, where you leave the shutter open for a long time. That kind of explains what the shutter does. Another place where high shutter speeds are used are sports photography. So if you use a really high shutter speed, what happens is that it uses very less light to come inside the camera, and in the process it also freezes the motion. Okay, so if you have players that are running really fast, skiing, jumping or whatever, and you use a really high shutter speed, really high, what happens? What happens is that the very, very tiny instant in time is captured. Okay, so that's how I can explain shutter speed or high shutter speed. Slow shutter speed is when there is no light. You need more light to come in to register in the camera, so you need a slow shutter speed at night. Let's talk about the aperture. What does the aperture do? Aperture increases or decreases the size of the opening of the lens, okay? So if you have a high shutter speed, a really high shutter speed, the natural combination is to have a bigger aperture and let more light come in. So you can let more light come in the instant that it does come in, so that you can really get the right exposure. In sports photography, what happens is that they increase the shutter speed to a really great extent. To compensate for that, they increase the aperture size and they increase the ISO so that they can register a picture, because closing the shutter at a very, very high rate is very important. So this is sports photography. Okay, and this is night photography. So let's talk a little about the ISO in combination with the shutter speed and the aperture. The ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. If you increase the sensitivity of the sensor, what happens is that it's going to register more light, more exposure, and that in combination with high shutter speed, high and a bigger aperture registers more light. Suppose you had to take a picture of in the middle of the night. You were at a glacier in the North Pole. Everything was dark. There's some light. What you would do is you would decrease the shutter speed. You may even leave the shutter open for a few hours, just to register that amount of light. You can have somewhat high ISO, increase the sensitivity a little, but once again, it depends on what you're looking for. The aperture does two things. It lets more or less light come in based on how open and how close it is. Once it is open, it also focuses to a very, very small area. That means it blurs the background. If the aperture is really wide open, it blurs the background, okay? If the aperture is really tiny, it's like a pinhole camera, it's really tiny aperture, it does not blur anything. It keeps everything in sharp focus. The whole scene is in sharp focus. Well, what's the payoff for that? The payoff for that is that there'll be less light coming in. So I would say that small aperture would go hand in hand with the shutter open for a long time and a higher ISO so that you can capture more light. Why would you use an aperture that is so tiny that everything is in focus? Well, because you may be taking a landscape picture. So in a landscape picture, you want to take everything from the first tree in front of you up to the mountain 5 miles away. So what happens is that you need to have the aperture really, really small. We'll get into the numbers a little later, but I'm just trying to explain the concept over here. In landscape photography, you make the aperture small, less light comes in. Chances are that you're taking a daytime picture, so you already have a lot of light. So you need depth of field by reducing the aperture. And or you can take the shutter speed and you can really increase it. If it's really noon, there's a lot of sun, a lot of light is coming in, you're not getting a meaningful picture. So that's what you can do. ISO should be dialed down, or you should make the sensitivity less. If it's daytime, it's landscape photography. On the contrary, let's say you're doing product photography and you had like a vase and flowers that you wanted to selectively have in focus. That means you wanted to blur certain parts in the background while you want to keep the foreground crisp and clear. That's when you use a wider aperture, or you increase the size of the aperture a little, okay? That way you can get what is called a blurring effect of the background, or it's called a shallow depth of field. It's called DOF, depth of field. So once again, the aperture, like you see, is allowing light to come in or not come in, but it's also blurring the background and not blurring the background, something that shutter cannot do, ISO cannot do. So each of these three have their own strengths, the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. So I hope this helps, and you're going to see a lot more about photography from me in my upcoming videos. Thank you.